Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Start Talking Alabama, Stigma and Discrimination in the LGBTQ Community in Alabama. Start Talking Alabama is a social media campaign that was created to reach young gay men of color in Alabama. Today's program will broaden the scope to include the larger LGBTQ community. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or join our conversation on Twitter or Facebook Live during our broadcast. The phone number, along with the Twitter and Facebook information, are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. If you check out the official Start Talking Alabama Facebook page, it will give you a chance to view the program, including a live look behind the scenes. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheet, and evaluation are all available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for today's program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation forms. While content may continue to be relevant, continuing education credit will only be awarded for 1 year for nurses, expiring on November 30, 2017, and 2 years for social workers, expiring on November 30, 2018. I'm Ty Williams, host of the Start Talking Alabama social media campaign, and joining me today, we have Shantae Wolf-Sisson. Shantae is an outreach paralegal fellow for the LGBT Rights Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Warren Dates. Warren Dates is the Area 5 Senior Peer Linkage Specialist with the Alabama Department of Public Health. And Michael Fordham. Michael is the Outreach Program Administrator at the 1917 Clinic at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Let's get started. So the topic for today will briefly and in-depthly discuss stigma and discrimination as experienced by the LGBT community, advocates, and allies. So I just want to start to kind of break the mold. So for me personally, regardless of the context, when I think of stigma and discrimination, it encompasses everything worldwide for me. Men go through stigma and discrimination, women go through stigma and discrimination, whether you live in an urban area or even a rural area. Now, I do believe that there are effects of stigmatization that affect different types of groups, such as minorities or people who are already marginalized based on their sexuality, their gender, or their ethnicity. So our panel is mixed up of a lot of different of those intersections of the community. So I just want to know, and we can start with you, Shantae, have you experienced any type of stigma and discrimination throughout that intersectionality?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me today. I can recall stigma in every aspect of my identities that intersect. Currently, starting when I moved to Alabama in 2013 and I was looking for work, and I was having a hard time figuring out why I wasn't getting a call back, but my friends were literally getting jobs quicker than I could. And then I realized that it was could be because I'm black, could be that I'm masculine presenting, lesbian, and that I don't particularly care to dress in the confines of what an employer who may be homophobic deems okay. So that shut me out of a lot of opportunities. And that's just one aspect of my life. Every day when we go try to apply for new things to do, we try to further our education, it's hard because we're in the South. We're still dealing with a lot of things that we didn't unpack from Jim Crow. So that's what I think about when I think about stigma. I think about hindering folks from reaching their full potential. I think of intentionally shutting folks out of new opportunities so them and their families and friends can be just like everyone else. Absolutely.
Now, Michael, I want to turn to you and give you an opportunity. I want to know if there are some specific instances that you can think of, just personal experiences regarding stigma and discrimination, and if you feel free to share on some of that.
Yeah. So growing up, I was kind of curious about who I was, and then as I got more comfortable, I kept finding myself in situations where I was kind of hesitant to be in because I was afraid that it would open up the door for other people to kind of question, are you gay, are you bi, are you straight, but then as I've kind of gotten more comfortable with who I am, I'm not afraid of that anymore. The only thing today is in healthcare. And for me, going to the doctors and I mean, especially for sexual health, it kind of opens up that door. You know, if it's a first-time doctor, you've never been there before, you're not sure how are they going to perceive your sexuality. And, you know, it takes courage, I think, to kind of just do it, kind of power through that.
Absolutely. Now, Warren, you and I have had several conversations about you linking clients and advocates to care, and we'll discuss that briefly a little bit later. But I want to go back to when you talked about growing up and kind of figuring out, you know, your hormones, you know, your sexuality, all those things, especially in adolescence. That is a very integral part of your physical, mental development. I want to know from you, Warren, if you believe that there is a such thing as self-stigma.
Yeah, I think we impose a lot of that on ourselves based on our own lived experience. I know for me, having realized that I was different early on in life, not just because of the unauthorized sexual experience at 13, but when I started trying to figure out why my attraction was both male and female, and that wasn't something I had been taught, was okay and acceptable. There were times that I would go in the closet with those thoughts because it wasn't acceptable, first at home, and then second in the larger community where I interacted. And so over time, until I was 36, I probably was my biggest stigmatization around who my identity and who I am as an individual was, even more so than the greater community that I interact in.
And this is kind of more so of a personal question, but you spoke about the internalization of what you had to go through. How do we combat that?
And so for me, it was being empowered to realize my truth. Having both lived socially and publicly as an outed individual that didn't understand who that person was, it was difficult for me to articulate what I was expecting others to perceive me to be, because I didn't truly know who that person was until I was 36. I credit my time working with Dr. Janetta B. Cole in an open, inclusive environment in the workplace that allowed me to find myself in the workplace, because as a result of her tutelage and her mentorship, I finally came to grips with understanding that being bisexual was okay. I finally came to understanding that it wasn't someone else's thought of me that made me. It was my thought of myself that identified me. And until I got to that point of clarity, it was hard for me to accept that Warren truly was who Warren is.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you touched on the subject of bisexuality, because a lot of times that is overlooked within the LGBTQ community. And we'll explore some of that later. But I want to stay on stigma and discrimination for right now, Shante. Some questions that I have, because they were talking about growing up and the challenges that are faced in your adolescence ages. How do we combat, whether it's guardians or parents, and kind of like implicit homophobia or just explicit homophobic period? Because there are some people who say, you know, things like, oh, we have to teach our young men at an early age that they're supposed to be into this, or they're supposed to be into this, or they're not supposed to like this. So how do we kind of combat homophobia when it's in our inner circle?
I think we have to start with realizing we have to take on the initiative to educate ourselves and stop relying on those who may be LGBT to educate us. I believe it also starts with recognizing the implicit bias that you may have that may come out when you are trying to teach children, or when you are providing healthcare services and you look at one person differently, or you kind of don't want to do their triage as happily as you would do the next. As soon as you start with self-reflection, I think you can start opening the door, because if you don't, it's impossible to be an ally to someone if you don't start from a place of selflessness and move next to how can I assist this person the best way I can without making this about my feelings.
Absolutely. So you spoke about community and its importance. how do you, because there are certain times when I log on Facebook and I see, you know, slightly racist things or some homophobic things, and it kind of occurs to me, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't really want to get into discussion with these people. I don't want to start anything. I'm just going to unfriend them or whatever. So how do you, I mean, is as big as social media is,
Right.
how can we efficiently kind of turn the page on some of that negativity without, you know, I guess, ruining personal friendships?
I think you have to set some boundaries, because I experience the same things where I have family members on Facebook that can say some kind of off-the-wall things, and you can lose friends in a matter of seconds on a Facebook thread, and it's atrocious that that is true. But I think a lot of things could be avoided if we have deliberate conversations about the problems instead of saying, oh, well, you were wrong for saying this and it offended me. Yes, that's true, but let me briefly explain while you go to Google and educate yourself why this was a problem, and you can still love them at the end of the day, because a lot of people don't know, and until they do know, they can change what they do.
Social media, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have in this movement for equality, because we are prominent. Gay culture is everywhere now, and even though we have people like Laverne Cox and RuPaul, they're still, you know, just your average people who post on Facebook and totally humiliate and degrade people, you know, from A to Z. So I just wanted to see, you know, because I like to engage people. I question everything. I challenge everybody on stigma, pronoun usage, everything. And I don't know. But what we'll do now is go back to, we talked about bisexuality, Warren. And I said that sometimes the B in the LGBTQ is left out. What do you think about that?
Sometimes it feels alien. I feel alienated. I'll use my pronouns. I feel alienated in the sense that we are not accepted as being who we are. You know, we, most of the time, even within the community, we're forced sometimes to identify either as straight or as gay, because even the community, the larger community, doesn't understand when they're completely lesbian or completely gay, that you can have feelings for both genders equally. Because I oftentimes get the question, well, how is it that you're attracted to a woman but you just married a man? I mean, that's the most recent question that I get. And I say it's very easy, because the attraction is to the human being, for me, more than anything. The person that I fell in love with happened to be a man. He happened to be with male genitalia, but that doesn't define him as being my attraction one way or the other. So I've oftentimes identified my bisexuality with the human quality of just loving people. And then when the lights come on and they happen to be male or female, then I have to say, okay, it's a she today. Or, yesterday it was a he. And be okay with that, understanding that for me, that's okay, not what others say for me is okay.
And I'm sure in that realm of bisexuality, there are some mental and emotional struggles that go along with that. And I'll get you to tag along on that. But Mike, I want to go back to when you were talking about your adolescence and building that trust level in the healthcare system. Speak about how important that is for providers and people who have that sort of access to everyday people.
I think it's very important. You know, you should feel that when you go to the doctor, that you can trust and feel comfortable being there, and that if you go and you say, I would want to be tested for this, that they'll say, okay, and not question you. I know a lot of people who aren't out and go to their family doctor they've gone to for 26 years or whatever it is, and they're nervous and they're embarrassed and they're, I don't want to get tested for that. I don't want to, have to basically come out to them that I'm gay or I'm bi. And I think that puts up a huge barrier and prevents a lot of people from getting the right kind of care, compassionate care, or even care at all. And I mean, that's a huge issue.
Absolutely. And I know for me personally, I don't have a primary care physician, and it's something that I'm working on, but even the important aspect of those relationships. I went to my pediatrician for 20 years. Like I haven't been recently because I feel bad now because I'm the oldest person in the room. Everybody's like, and I'm like, can I get an HIV test? And so the relationship part, I think, is the most important part of that whole retention to care, services, everything. And Warren, you can speak on that a lot because you work in that. So shed some light on that.
And so I would say to our providers who are listening, the easiest thing that you can do to approach a person's identity when it comes to their sexual orientation is just treat them like a human being. Allow them the space to come out when they're ready. Don't push them out just because Medicare, Medicaid, or Blue Cross says that you have to have this checked off for this annual physical. People are going to come to you, as Mike said, in the way in which they feel most comfortable. And when they ask you something that's not a part of their routine visit conversation with you, don't treat them as if it's a bad thing when they ask you. Don't victimize them for asking for a rectal exam, for example, when they didn't do it before, because there's probably a reason why they're getting to that point. And so we have to be welcoming and embracing of people for where they are in their moment of identity versus taking them to the point that we feel as a professional we want them to go.
Right. And it's so important, Chanté, you can kind of piggyback on some of this, especially for LGBTQ people and their civil rights. When they go to these healthcare providers, you know, they're dealing with oppression at home. They're dealing with, you know, loneliness at home. So they feel like when they do finally reach out, they feel like, okay, I don't want to go here either. So then that mental struggle of not only being LGBTQ, but now you have that mental struggle of worrying about your sexual health and your sexual concerns.
Absolutely, and to piggyback off of what you all said, I think for LGBT folks, there is a component of visibility that is important in the healthcare system, because I know for me it was a struggle to find doctors that were affirming. So I totally understand why people decide, maybe when they're sick, decide not to go to the ER because they don't have to run into issues of their name not matching their driver's license. If you're trans, or you not fitting the description of your driver's license photo. If you're like me, you're gender nonconforming. Though those things are still, especially in Alabama, existing, on top of the fact that you don't really know if someone exists that may be affirming, because if you don't have access to resources, you may not have access to the transportation that can get you to the resources that could get you help. So the mental stigma and stress generally around healthcare for LGBT folks is an issue that we need to handle, but I think that with the help of HRC and a lot of local Alabamian organizations, LGBT folks can now go to Hayden's List and look up a therapist that did a bad job with someone and say, oh, I'm not going to them, they're not getting my copay, and you can find someone that can help you.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you mentioned the trans community, because just like bisexual, the T in the acronym sometimes gets left out. But I want to go back to, you talked about gender nonconforming. Tell the people what that is and kind of give just a general description for those who don't know.
So gender nonconforming folks, as myself, as I proclaim myself, is people who may not dress according to the social standard of what a woman or a male looks like. For instance, when I go to work, I wear a tie sometimes, I wear khakis, I look like P. Diddy. Sometimes I have a friend who is very feminine, and sometimes he wears skirts to work, sometimes he wears tights, is whatever he's feeling. It's the fluidity about it that makes folks non-conforming.
I love that word, fluidity. Sexuality is so fluid, and that goes back to our physical development as a child. But I want to talk about something kind of political, but it focuses on the importance of, as you said, gender sexuality. So HB 2 was a House bill, and it's officially known as the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act. Okay, and that was passed in North Carolina in March of 2016. And it basically states that persons must use the bathroom or changing facility that corresponds to the sex that is listed on their birth certificate. Talk about that.
I think this bill and also with the Indiana bill, and also with HB 1523 in Mississippi, just tries to reinvent the wheel of discrimination in the United States that needs to stop, because people deserve access to the basic amenities that straight people don't have to think about when they wake up in the mornings.
Absolutely. And it's been considered the most anti-LGBTQ law in the land. I mean, I can't even imagine, you know, I think Target was one of the people who initially came out, the first, and I mean, of course there were people who were joyful, but then there were also people who were like, okay, I'm going to have to take my kid to the bathroom. There were, you know, questions of concerns from parents, whether they were validated or invalid. You know, those concerns were obviously there, and it forced the nation to start having a conversation. And like I said, with social media, gay culture being out there, I think with these instances, as awful as some of them are, it's forcing the national light to shine when it comes to LGBTQ rights.
Because ultimately, we just want to be included as the human beings that we are. You know, we in our culture want to make our subset in the acronym be separate, but we're equal. We are the same as any straight person in this country. We are law-abiding citizens. We pay taxes. We have all the other rights that are there, so why shouldn't we have the public right to go to the restroom of our choice or of our designation? I think a lot of times people are usually going to discriminate against the things that they're afraid of or they're not knowledgeable about. And so most of the powwow that you heard around the bills, particularly in North Carolina, was more so because people just refused to educate themselves about LGBTQ people. They just refuse to, and there's no reason to be afraid of us. Most of the people who get to know us say they're the best friends to have when they really get to know us, because we're just like anybody else. We're no one to be afraid of in that sense. And I think until we get to an open space where everyone's welcome in this society, then we really can't say we're the United States of America.
Absolutely. And we're going to break away to a Facebook question in just a second, but you spoke about the Indiana bill. And for the people who don't know out there, the Indiana bill is kind of the Religious Freedom Act, and it allows businesses to basically discriminate based on persons or individuals' religious beliefs. But we'll break away to a Facebook question, and then we'll finish that conversation.
Yes, we have a Facebook Live question from Danielle Houston, and her question is, what advice do you offer or have for discussing non-binary gender issues and heteronormative bias with healthcare providers?
It's a very scientific question.
It is. And I love my friend Danielle. I actually know who she is, and I thank you for chiming in. But the first thing that I would say is most of our providers are straight, you know, unless we go to chronicles that exist in our local states where we have anthologies that gives us professionals that we can access based on their identity. We have to make the assumption that most people make about us, and that's they are straight. And so when we choose a provider, that depending on where we are in our identity and our being out, I think it's important to establish that relationship as who you are with your provider to make sure that they are providing you based on how you want to be treated. And so I would say, based on my own experience, when I chose my primary care physician 5 years ago, she's female. And so there were barriers that could have existed for the fact that we were two different genders. So we had that discussion initially. After we got that wall down, then I came out to say to her that I was bisexual, and we had that conversation. And then we started talking about, well, what does prevention look like in terms of your sexual history, given the fact that you've identified that way? And so I think as long as we layer it in the conversations of our comfort, then we'll be received at every visit in the way we want to be and respected in the same vein, because then we have taken control of that conversation and that visit versus allowing the provider to give us their perspective on how we need to be treated.
Absolutely. Did you want to jump in?
No, I think that was perfect.
Oh,
the only thing I had to add was another way to combat that is introducing trainings to staff in these healthcare places that don't know how to engage with non-binary and trans folks. That's all I have to say.
And to her point, thank you for bringing that up. Cultural sensitivity is an issue that we hear many times now in our community when it comes to training. Cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. And I think that for me, sometimes they get overused because we can train them by textbook. But it's all about how you treat people when they walk in the door. The textbook can't teach you that. And if you're having a bad day and someone comes in who happens to, by name, show Shantae, I'll use you for example, yet she comes in and presents Warren, you can't have a reaction to her because you were expecting Shantae that you saw last week, and she decided to express herself as Warren this week. You have to embrace people for what you know about them at that moment and respect them for who they are in front of you, not for who you want to impose upon them, being who you want them to be.
Absolutely, and I think those conversations, they have to be universal. They can't just be the healthcare providers that are central in this room. It has to be the receptionist. It has to be the janitor. It has to be everybody that encompasses that one space.
Exactly.
Because if your healthcare provider is the only one that's culturally competent, and you walk outside and, you know, the janitor or the crew worker, they're sweeping and they give you a dirty look. Whatever that healthcare provider just did, it's all erased. It's all gone. And I know you do some work at the 1917 clinic, so just shed some light on, you know, some of your history there and some of the things you do there.
So my main goal and my main job is education, so specifically HIV and other STIs, and outreach, so kind of reaching, for me it's the more of the UAB campus itself. We also do the greater Birmingham area, and then I do HIV testing, counseling, risk assessment. So, you know, that's kind of, you know, when you talk about trans and gender non-binary, we get those people that come in and get tested. And as the 20-minute test runs, we go through a risk assessment. We're asking some very personal questions. And you have to kind of meet them where they're at as who they are, and realize, you know, okay, you might be the first person that I have ever met that is different than me in some way, but you're still treating them as an individual and respecting who they are, what they tell you. You're getting through to them, meeting them where they're at, and I've learned that, and I've really enjoyed it. You know, we actually had a clinic meeting 2 weeks ago, and we brought in Lacey Kennedy from AIDS Alabama, and she hit on kind of what you were talking about from front desk staff, nurses, the janitors in the hallways, and the sensitivity that they have to have, and the awareness that they have to have, you know, because like you said, it could make or break their entire visit. And if they're greeted at the front desk in a way that they don't want to be greeted, then they could get into the back and not trust the doctors, not trust the nurses, because, you know, right from the gate, it was thrown out the window.
Because I'll speak from personal experience. If I'm accessing my provider and I happen to get to the receptionist and she's warm, but then I get to the nurse and the nurse gives me attitude because the patient before me pissed her off for whatever reason, and it's now coming to me, then it shuts me down and makes me lose track of what I intended to share with the provider when I got there, simply because of my experience with the nurse. And so to your point, from the security guard, if there's one on hand when you first park your car, all the way until that visit's over, everybody has to understand that you chose to work here. We didn't ask you to come here. You chose to work here. Be happy every day you clock in for being in a space that's not what we call in this society normal. And as a result of your choice to do so, then you should be respectful of the people who are accessing that space, because we are accessing it for the needs that we have when we come there.
Absolutely. And I want to share statistics. Well, one statistic, and I'll wait to share the other one later, but I pulled this from the ADPH website, and it says in Alabama, adolescents and young adults aged 15 to 29 years old are twice as likely to be infected with HIV versus an average Alabama resident. Shed some light on that and how important it is to have a proactive sexual mindset when you're out, you know, engaging in behavior, whether it's risky or not risky. Just shed some light on the importance of testing, HIV testing, STD testing, just the full arena of proactive sexual health.
So everybody, well, not everybody, but people are having sex. We know this. But we're also prudish to talk about it.
Right.
And, you know, if you're not comfortable talking about it, should we be doing it? And so, I mean, those are conversations that can start at home. I mean, a lot of kids are already doing it or talking about it with their friends. It's important that, you know, we have accurate information about HIV, other STIs. There's so much stigma around testing itself. People are afraid to get tested, whether it's because they're afraid to know their status. It might out them for whatever reason. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go to CVS and buy one of those Aura Quick take-home tests for a friend because they were too nervous to go buy it themselves, because who might see them? And that's sad. That is very sad. But testing is so important, and anymore it's so easy to do.
Right.
And you can do it for free.
The access to it through ADPH from that perspective is so seamless now. We have many ASO providers, aid service organizations, community-based organizations across the state, and then you have your public health centers across the state where HIV testing is free. So going to CVS is not necessary.
Right.
You can access the public health care that exists in your community to be able to get the testing done. But I say to everyone, when you come to of age at 13, you've pretty much understood that you have an identity of some sort. You may not have figured out where your placement's going to be, but you know you exist. And when you begin to engage, be it oral sex, anal sex, or vaginal sex, in the definitions of those, you're at risk for some potential STI that exists. But the most important thing that I try to articulate to people when I'm talking about sexual health is that you must start a conversation. If you're going to engage someone, find out what their history is. Yes, it's going to feel awkward because we don't in this society make sexual health an everyday conversation. We've made it stigmatized in such a way that just because I ask you the question about are you sexual, that's a taboo thing. Because in Alabama, we call it the Bible Belt. That's not supposed to be done before you're married. But the reality is people don't wait till they get married.
Right.
But then they're not having they're not having conversations to ask pertinent questions about a person's history before they engage them, and then they get a hiccup, and we have to see them at the health department, or we have to see them at the ASOs because they've then had this STI happen. And so I say to people that before you engage, please communicate. First and foremost, communicate. And then when you get to a point that you're ready to make that step, protect yourself, because there are plenty of things that we have at our disposal in terms of prevention that will help you keep the possibility of getting an STI out of your toolkit, in your toolkit.
And the piggyback off of all of that, and you said taboo, which made me think about the fact that as advocates, as legislators, as educators, we owe youth in Alabama comprehensive sex education that will decriminalize the idea of going to get tested, that will teach them about their bodies, that will teach them what it means to go out and get PrEP. Or if you wanted to get PrEP, these are the places you can go. Kids don't talk about what it really means to be safe because they don't know, first of all, who to talk to about it, and they just assume that they're going to learn about it from Tumblr or until a friend of theirs has an incident. So I think it's important because those statistics you just gave us are very true, and a lot of people just want to be naive to the fact that students are having sex at rates that, you know, are just things that we need to deal with. So we need, when I say comprehensive sex education, I mean sex education, like you said, that is medically accurate, that informs our youth to make sound decisions, and that teaches them and empowers them not only what it looks like to have sex positivity, but also teaches them what healthy relationships look like. How do I know when my friend is being toxic? How do I know when my partner is being abusive? We can start sex education at an early age. You didn't just have to start at 13 when they start realizing somebody's cute.
Absolutely. And in adolescence, and especially high school, you know, there are so many other factors outside of sex. I mean, a lot of people are introduced to drinking, drugs, a lot of things that are really heavy and can be very heavy, especially in the LGBTQ community. It's just really alarming. And I know for me, I did not have sex in high school because I was scared, because my sexual education class was not anything to play with. Like, it was the scariest thing I'd ever been through. She had pictures, people's private parts, genitalia, you know, sores. I was just like, okay, no, don't. But now that I look back on it, I'm like, well, was it healthy to be afraid of having sex? That's something that I was thinking about. And even it occurred to me in high school. There were concerns about body image, especially within our young female counterparts, body image, and this obsession that we have with celebrityism. I guess that's going to be a word today. You know, that is really a really interesting dynamic, because it seems like a lot of people are internalizing some of the stigma that they go through, and then they're expressing it with erratic behavior.
And to that point, I remember being in middle school, when it came to me trying to find myself, so to speak. I was short for a long time. Didn't have a growth spurt really until my 8th to 9th grade year, and so I was rather slim and short in my standard, according to my peers. And so I remember distinctly going on a diet that was self-imposed, because I felt like I was, 1, too small, and 2, not tall enough for my peers to be accepted. And so looking back on it, that was a trauma that I carried through life, because oftentimes I look at myself in the mirror, even now, and say, well, Warren, you put on a couple extra pounds, perceiving that others may think that I'm getting fat. And then there's the reverse of the body shaming of expecting to live in a certain scope of who you've always been, knowing that now at 40, I'm just not going to be 125 or 30 pounds like I was at 20. But we have to get away from stigmatizing ourselves on many fronts. And I think body shaming is one just as tantamount to our orientation. Because until we're able to accept us being who we are authentically in that space today, then others can't do it too.
And when you talk about body shaming, that made me think about the media's portrayal of LGBT people and how that plays a direct role of the lack of confidence LGBT youth has. Because when you look on the screen, you see a nice hunk or a real nice looking girl who's a lesbian, and you look in the mirror and like, well, that's not where I'm at today. But yeah, we need to start having some real conversations and put the people who are the actual faces of our communities. Right. It's the people, it's our educators, it's our firemen, it's kids out on the block playing basketball. That is what LGBT looks like, and it doesn't always look like a pixie cut or a mohawk all the time. But
absolutely. For those of you watching, we're also doing a Facebook Live broadcast, and I think we have a comment from someone there.
Yes, we have a comment from Samuel. He said he loves the conversation around communication. One way to make those conversations easier and more valuable for you with your partner or partners is to already know your own story, status, and past experiences.
Absolutely. That was Samuel. Thank you, Samuel, for that. It's really important to, and I call it selfishness. Like, I am very selfish when it comes to my progression, whether it's my mental state, my health state, or my physical state. And it's so weird because it affects my relationships when I'm dating, because I'm so used to everything being about me. And and it affects, but I advocate for it because it gives me empowerment. It makes me strive, and it makes me go talk to my friends and try to lift them up. But it's important that you have a social circle, some type of social support. And that goes back to what Samuel said. It's really important. We have to find ways or techniques to resolve stigma and discrimination. And, you know, just basically remember that it doesn't have anything to do with you as an individual. You have to remember that, but you also have to seek help. And I know a lot of times people don't want to necessarily seek help. Especially in the Bible Belt, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of people would say, well, you need to go read the Bible, or you need to go pray.
Or go talk to your preacher.
Exactly. You know, it's just a lot of things that encompass what the Bible Belt kind of goes to. But Warren, speak a little bit more about the importance of seeking help, whether it's mental or, well, focus on the mental aspect.
Health.
Absolutely.
Because our mental health helps to dictate what we do physically. You know, when we are oftentimes feeling a moment of depression or a little less confident within who we are, we tend to make decisions based on that feeling that that put us at risk for things. And when we're engaged, Samuel just brought up a really good point when he said your sexual partner or partners, because we also have to realize and understand that there are some of us who desire multiple partners when we're engaging sexually, and that in itself is risky behavior, but it can be a type of, there are mechanisms in place that even that can be healthy if that's what your choice of sex is. But to be able to access mental health, being able to be self-centered in one's own space that makes you neutral to be able to receive whatever the universe is bringing to you that day, I think is tantamount to everybody's living. For me, I've come to a point in my own self-reflection that traditional religion is respected, but it's not for me. And I've come to accept that that's okay as a preacher in the South who happens to identify as black, male, and bisexual, which we would say in a lot of circles that would never be accepted. And it hasn't been. You know, it's not been an easy road because, again, I allowed each one of those identities not to intersect at some point. I tried to conform to what was acceptable in the space that I chose to reside in until I got to a point that I realized that that full circle was my full circle. Then and only then could I be totally true to who I was in all spaces. And so for me mentally, I have to reflect daily on the fact that I am who I am, and today this is my audience. And my audience may or may not agree with me, but I have to be willing to respect them as much as I expect that they will respect me. And when we get to the point of understanding that is the universal good for all of us, then and only then I think will we be accepting and open to people being different than we are. Because we all are different, but we have to be willing to embrace the difference in each other, and that's what makes us universal and equal.
Absolutely. So you brought up an interesting topic. You know, I didn't really want to go into the spirituality realm, but we'll go there. And Michael, I don't know if you want to comment, but what about some terms or some messages that we can give to our young people watching, or even, you know, healthcare providers who know that someone is dealing with something, whether it's mental or health or physically, messages of support that aren't necessarily spiritually driven, I guess you could say.
As I was kind of coming about knowing who I was and being comfortable with that, one thing that I learned is to own your story. Like, everybody's story is different, and everybody's going to be in a different chapter of their story. But if you own your story and you're comfortable enough with your story, it puts a lot of things into perspective. And it also makes it easier for you to help other people own their story. It makes it easier to understand them and their story. And I know that's not easy for everybody, but it's kind of how I did it. Was I said, okay, this is me. I'm going to own my story. And when you own your story, you take away the ability of other people to own your story. And I think, you know, that's an important thing to teach.
I would add that for me, the recent divorce, if you will, in quotes, from traditional theology and doctrine of denomination, being able to kind of chisel away at the stigma that exists from clergy to clergy, being of that profession, one of the ways that I've been able to successfully do it is not approach it in the congregational setting versus having a one-on-one conversation with the leaders of those congregations. Because until they come to understand that the thought processes that they have aren't necessarily the only thought processes that exist when it comes to theology, and they become informed, then and only then can you approach the group discussion. And I'm using this example because the last church that I was a member of, the pastor approached me about my sexuality because he said, we're having issues in the church. There are many people who are having issues with you being in the pulpit because traditionally speaking, what you do is against the theology and the doctrine that we teach. And I said to him that that's respectful that you would say that, but I don't embrace the fact that that's the only thought process. And so we had to have many discussions one-on-one about how I came to my conclusion about me being accepted in God's sight is the same as a straight person being accepted in God's sight. And when we got to that point and I left the church, we're still friends. He respects me. He asks about my husband in ways that I never thought he would because he was a very traditionalist in his thought processes, but it took me having to educate him one-on-one before he started to open his mind to what he had been shaped to thinking was the only truth that existed. And I oftentimes go back to this for the Bible believers, that the word says to you, study to show yourself approved. A workman not needed to be ashamed to rightly divide the word of truth. It says yourself. It doesn't say your preacher. It doesn't say your congregation. It doesn't say your denomination. It says study for yourself. And until we grapple with whatever it is our spiritual teachings are for ourselves, then and only then can we say we know how to respect others for their thought processes because they may be different than ours.
Absolutely. And I think that puts the hammer on the nail when it comes to spirituality. Now, we talked earlier about, you spoke about not feeling pressure to conform to typical stereotypes. You spoke about, no, Michael, that was you who spoke about being authentic and exploring. You talked about integrating within your intersectionalities. What are some other techniques that you use in your personal life to, because you do a lot of advocating and you meet a lot of people, what are some other techniques that you utilize to get people to just be comfortable being who they are?
I think I do that by approaching my advocacy from the idea of being selfless in my interactions with those who need help. I don't come into the situation with this savior complex because that makes people feel demeaned and they feel like they're being coddled and patronized, and that's not what they need. They're grown just like I'm grown, and though they need help, they got common sense like I need help. So aside from that, another thing that I do is I always make sure that I'm transparent in my interactions and what I can and cannot provide for such person that I might be helping at the time. But if there is a situation where I may not be able to help them as much as I want to, I make sure that I follow through by connecting them with someone in the community that can provide the resources that they need. Because I think in advocacy, where we drop the ball is if we feel like sometimes we can't help people, we just say, I'm sorry. But you don't have to stop at I'm sorry. You can stop, I'm sorry, let me call Amy and she can, put you in contact with someone that can help you. One last thing that I do actually is I open the floor for them to ask me questions, because so many times we go into, I know for myself personally, I go all across the Deep South and I go into communities where people ain't never seen my face before. So they're like, okay, what are you doing here? So I was like, you got questions, ask me where I'm from, what I'm about, because I'll tell you and I'll be honest with you, because I want to build the rapport enough for you to feel confident in telling me what you need.
And I'm so glad you're here today, and I love every time we get together because you've been on many Start Talking Alabama videos, but we want to get a little bit of more what you do at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Give us kind of general brief, or however in-depth you want to go about some of the services you provide. So
the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971. We're a nonprofit organization combating discrimination, intolerance, and hate by education and litigation, through education and litigation efforts. My team personally, the LGBT Rights Project, we protect LGBT children and violence from violence and harassment in schools. We protect the medical rights of trans folks in the justice system, such as Ashley Diamond, who was a real famous case, who was being denied her treatment in the Georgia facilities. We also litigate on behalf of students, and we make sure that their first right amendments are protected. And that means if you want to wear a shirt that says, I am gay and proud, you should be able to do that in the school system because you are protected to do so. So that's a little bit about the work that I do. You'll find me across the Deep South giving Know Your Rights trainings to college students, high school students, service providers. I'm just making the South better. Well, we're making the South better, and I'm glad to be here.
We're glad you're here. Now, excuse me for that. I've done some research on the Southern Poverty Law Center, and
Right.
it was a very controversial topic that I believe y'all work on, and you can probably piggyback on some of that because it, and I hate to go back to the religion, but it does have to do with the religion. We can't get away from that in Alabama, unfortunately. But it's about gay to straight conversion therapy. Talk a little bit about that.
So conversion therapy is basically what you hear it as, is the idea that someone can change someone's sexuality through therapy or prayer or intense camps where they go, and I'm not really sure what happens at these camps, but they assume that they're going to turn people straight through a lot of efforts that are really harmful and toxic to folks' mental health. We see these often, especially in New Jersey, where we had a case personally where we were dealing with a New Jersey organization that claimed that they could cure folks of homosexuality. And it's a weird phenomenon because I know, particularly for black folks, we may not see it as a conversion therapy group. What we may see is we'll go to church and the pastor will say that he has a word on his heart, but really he's trying to get you up to the altar to pray your gay away. Because that's happened to me personally, where I've been to churches and it turned into a whole ordeal where they were throwing holy water on me, and I'm not really sure what was supposed to happen next because obviously we're here today. But Warren, I'm gonna let you take it away.
I would simply say, thank you, Shante, but I would simply say there's no such thing.
Yeah.
We want to, there's funding for that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it delivers. Through my own personal experience, I will tell you, as many times as I've fallen on my knees, so to speak, to pray this identity away, it's still here. What you come to realize is that we were all created in the likeness of whatever universal creation we serve. We were created. That's the beginning of it all. You can't get away from what you were created to be. You might not be taught that that's acceptable because it's conditioning. When we come through our families, I know in mine, it was always articulated. There's a boy, there's a girl. They get together, they have children, they get married. Or they have children and then, or they get married and then they have children. That was the overarching theme that I grew up with. Well, when I was able to introduce a different conversation, my mother goes, "Oh no, I don't think that's who you are." And I said, "Mom, you can't tell me who I am. You don't live in these shoes every day. I know what I see, and what I see is lovingness when it comes to a woman, and I see lovingness when it comes to a man. I can't explain that. I probably never will be able to explain that, but it is who I am, and therefore I embrace that's who I am." And eventually she came along and accepted it and got over it and dealt with it at church and still does, because it was an interesting paradigm to find that she had to go back and say, "My son's getting married, and oh, by the way, to a man." But she was very supportive, and God love her. She's been with me every step of the way. But I say to many who might be listening or are watching that, again, it's about self-love. Once you come to understand who you are, you don't allow anybody in society, be it your denominational circle, your work circle, or your family circle, to dictate you. You have the right to make that decision for yourself.
Absolutely. Now, Michael, I want to go back, get you back in on the conversation. I'm going to give you a statistic. You know I love statistics. So I was reading an article on the Huffington Post, and it states 1 in 5 students still report being bullied at school. Of that population, LGBTQ students are approximately 91% more likely to be bullied than their heterosexual peers. Working, like you said, at the UAB campus, what are some things that you have seen? I'm not sure if they do have some type of bullying. I'm sure they do. Program or harassment program. And then also, do you believe that more schools should implement what they call GayStraight Alliances?
Absolutely. In those a word we hear a lot now is safe zones. And the GayStraight Alliance provides a safe zone for LGBTQ students to feel surrounded by, similar people or allies that they can let that guard down. But outside of the GayStraight Alliance, there's also at UAB, for example, there's several groups. Some of them are big, some of them are small, and we partner with a lot of them for outreach events on the campus.
And are they student-led?
Some of them are student-led, and others are like a faculty or staff-led with heavy student involvement. I know, for example, UAB has an Office of Diversion and Inclusion, which that's something pretty new within the last couple of years. And I think those are great tools on a campus. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, National Coming Out Week, and it was on the UAB Green. They set up for community partners, whether it's in the Birmingham community or the campus community, to come in. It was a tabling event coming out on the green, and it was aimed at people passing by. It was aimed at the LGBTQ students, and it was neat to be a part of. But there was also a program that UAB was running called That Don't Fly, and it went a lot farther than the LGBTQ. It went into sexual assault, sexual harassment, and all of that. Bullying was a big one. And kind of their little marketing was they had posters all over with birds that we know don't fly, like penguins. And it said, that don't fly, but neither does bullying.
Right.
And, it was neat to be a part of that as well. It was another tabling event with UAB student government was there, the Fraternity and Sorority Council, UAB Police Department. Then you had Birmingham community partners like the Crisis Center. And I think it's important when you have that to not just have a campus, but you also have to have the surrounding community involved as well.
Right. And I would go to the, back to, if I may, to the point of safe zone, creating a safe zone. And I think we have a question as well pending. For me, when I'm in public, I get teased all the time because I wear beads. And the first question that comes from everybody is, did you go to Mardi Gras? And while it's true that I did get my beads from Mardi Gras, it's oftentimes my safe space creation for LGBT people, so that I don't necessarily have to come out in the audience, but I open up the audience of myself to them to know that I'm engaging if they need me in a safe way. If it's one-on-one or this corporate environment is welcoming enough that we can talk about whatever your issue may be as well. And so you'll see me oftentimes with either my flags around my neck and my beads, or you'll see me in LGBT colors. And so I've made it that a personal thing as part of my imagery and branding, so that people understand that in my bisexuality, I'm open everywhere I go. And until we get to the point where we have leaders who are willing to be that one somebody, because it takes being the one somebody sometimes, to step up, be bold, be firm in who you are, until we get to that point where everybody's willing to do that, then there's some of us who have to make the sacrifice of making ourselves available for the greater good, because not everybody is at that space for us. But we want to allow for them to get there if they want to.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad. It sounds like UAB is really sparking the conversation and getting Alabama to start talking, and it sounds like they're changing the environment, which is great. Okay, Facebook question?
So yeah, Shannon had a question about ex-gay conversion. So what are the legal status of it now? It's it's diminishing. Do we know if it's outlawed anywhere, or is it that type of thing?
I'm not sure on that. I think if we can pinpoint that question, we'll definitely get some information back to her on that. Warren, you talked about, and I'm sorry we couldn't answer that.
That's all right.
I don't know. Because that's a really good question. It's really important to a lot of people, especially in the Bible Belt. But we'll definitely get you some information regarding that. Back to the panel. I want to talk about, so we discussed stigma and discrimination. We talked about conversion therapy, spirituality. I want to talk about something that's coming up in a few days, and that's voting. I would like, I'm going to start with Michael. Just give your self-declared message on the importance of voting.
I think voting obviously is important. It's how our democracy is shaped around. But it's a way for people to actively participate. And unfortunately, and it feels like in this election, more than any other that I can remember, there's a lot more news about voter suppression. And, you know, in the South, that's a big problem. You don't really hear about that in a lot of other parts of the country. But, you know, I made a point a couple of weeks ago, actually, double-checked that I was actually registered. Because I was hearing of people who were showing up to vote, early voting, and, oh, you're not active. And so I double-checked, okay, I'm going to just make sure that I'm registered and do it before the deadline, the voting deadline, the registration, so that if you are not, for whatever reason, an active voter, you have time to go and become an active voter. Yeah, I voted in my first election in 2008, and I was just so excited. I was like, I'm leaving school early, I'm going to vote, and I did. And it was a way to feel like I had participation, and a way to feel that I had ownership of something greater than myself.
Absolutely. And now, I'm glad you said that last part, that you had ownership and you were able to do something, but you spoke about voter suppression. I was reading an article, another statistic, or more so a fact. It was in Macon-Bibb County, and voter suppression, I think, happened, but I'm going to share what happened, and I'm going to let you guys kind of dissect it. So they changed a polling place in a primarily black neighborhood from a gym to a sheriff's office. Voter suppression. Okay?
So location. Let's talk about location and accessibility, which is something that people who need to access care have as a barrier as well at times, because transportation, we know, particularly for people living with HIV, sometimes that can be a barrier for them accessing care to begin with, just because the clinic may not be within a community where there is public transportation, especially if we're talking about our rural communities. But to that point, I think changing the facility from a gym, which is a pretty neutral zone for most people, safe zone for most people, to access to a sheriff's department. I know if I'm wanted for any reason, I'm not going to vote, even though I'm legally able to, because I have not necessarily been tried, convicted of a felony. So at that point, I'm able to still vote. But if I know I have to go to the sheriff's department, where I potentially might get in trouble when I show my identification, I'm less likely to go and access that voting place. And so I think it's problematic. But I'll speak from personal experience of having both run for personal public office and from having voted since '96. I'm a little bit senior to all of y'all on the panel. But one of the things that I say about the voting process for me personally is that it's very liberating when I cast my vote. There's nothing that I've quite gotten to other than identification of who I am that makes me feel better about myself, because I realize as a black male from the South, all of the struggles that were necessary for me to have the option to even do that. That wasn't long before I was born. And so I make it a valiant effort to make sure that even when I don't agree with either candidate that may be running, I still exercise the right to vote, because it is a right that may or may not exist depending on who gets elected. And so it's important for people to do it, even if you don't agree with whatever the candidate representing your party of choice is. You still need to go, because whether it's the presidential election or our local elections, laws are made. And as citizens of a country where democracy exists, that's what governs how we operate as individuals on a daily basis. And so it's tantamount that whether you agree or disagree with the platforms that are there, the only way to engage in your daily living and right to live is through the voting process. And so I would encourage everybody, regardless of your choice of who it is, please go vote.
I remember I too voted for the first time in 2008, and I remember being on a historically black college campus during that election night, and everybody filling out on campus at Savannah State University, just happy that we elected our first black president. Voting for me is very personal because I have family who were marching on Bloody Sunday and got trampled just to vote, and I think I'm concerned about my own generation because I wonder if people realize just how much people are being prevented currently from voting. That's going on, the voter suppression that we just talked about. It's ridiculous because there are still Alabamians to this day that cannot vote because they have been convicted of a crime permanently, like can't vote. And that's scary. So I went to the poll office a couple of months ago. I actually couldn't vote because somehow when I sent in my voter registration, my papers were lost. So it is important to follow through and make sure, hey, this is what we need. It's also important to have people at the polls to make sure people have what they need, because a lot of people go home because they don't know, oh, I don't have an ID, but I have a student ID. Okay, I can still vote. But they don't know they can because they're not educated on the rights that they have as a voter in the United States. So I think we need to start having that conversation as well as reminding our youth that voting is important, because while, like Warren said, the candidates may not be our choice of tea, it's better to have an option of picking the tea that you want instead of just sitting back and drinking water sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm so glad y'all are kind of giving your personal experience. And I'm going to share a story because voter suppression, racial injustice, and equality is something that we have talked about heavily in my home. So my mother is from rural South Carolina, and she has always shared with me the importance of education and taking advantage of the opportunities that you have before you. So when I heard stories, of her just growing up in her daily life, having to use textbooks that were years old, having to drive miles, hours to the nearest school that her parents felt she would be as resourceful as she could be, or they wanted her to be in the future. So when she shares stories of racial injustice, one particular story I can just see in my mind is when she said that the KKK came to her house and burned a cross in her front yard. There are people who believe that that group represents heritage. There are some people that believe that group represents hate. And there are some people that believe they represent heritage and hate. What are some tools that you think we can utilize to promote equality?
I think as the black community, we can promote equality by continuing to be blunt and frank about the conversations that we need to have about the injustices that black people are currently facing economically, educationally, and systematically in all sorts of systems that the U.S. has. I also think that once we do that, those in the spaces that may not be directly affected by institutional oppression need to look at themselves and their communities and see how they can be an ally to those who are most marginalized. That can mean LGBT folks, that can mean undocumented folks, that can mean black people, that can mean anyone who is currently in the United States or abroad who does not have access to the things you may have simply based on what you were born into, which could be privilege at times, which could be straight cis privilege. When I say cisgender, I mean when you identify as the person you are presented as on your birth certificate. So that's what I think.
Absolutely. And Michael, I want to get your perspective, because obviously Shantae is speaking from a black perspective and a black background, but we want to get your opinion as well.
I think some of it is a generational thing, right? So we all know Colin Kaepernick and other members of various pro teams have taken to respectfully protesting during the national anthem. And I was having a conversation with my mom and dad, and they disagreed with it, and I think, it's his right to do so. But it comes from respect. Respecting that other people are different, knowing other people are different for one, and respecting that, and not being afraid of that honest and open conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it could be. I'm originally from Colorado, And so I've been in Alabama since 2009, and I went to the University of Alabama. And there were times where a majority of the students in certain classes that I was in were African Americans. And that was the first time that I had ever felt like a minority. And it was eye-opening. Whereas I think a lot of African Americans probably, they may think about that, may notice it, and other times they might not, because it's just been a way of life. And then there were, you know, it was about the same time as the Trayvon Martin shooting, and you had half the class divided and the other half. And for me, it was uncomfortable because, again, it was like the first time that I had ever really been in such a diverse situation, and I learned from it. You know, it was uncomfortable, but a lot of things are uncomfortable, and you know, it's what we do as a society, as a culture. That's how we better ourselves. Is we sit in these uncomfortable situations, we talk about things respectfully, and we move on together.
Yeah, I think it's important to note or add to that point that as we age, generationally speaking, and we grow from the things that we've been taught at home, because that's where our first set of teaching comes from, and then we get into school and we start becoming a part of whatever that culture looks like, and then we become adults, it is incumbent upon us as individuals to reach beyond what's normal looking and comfortable feeling for us, to be exposed to things that we may or may not have gotten from the beginning of our educational lives. And so for me, through my adolescence, high school, predominantly I was one of few blacks in most of my classes because I was smart. I won't deny it. I was a smart kid. I was a bookie, but part of that was my mother making sure that I was a bookie, and my father making sure that I was always educating myself. And so I went to an all-white church as a teenager. I was the only black member, and was proud to stand on the dais for annual Youth Day and direct an all-white choir as a black conductor. But I didn't see the dynamics for what it was at the time, because for me, I hadn't really experienced racism, even though I was from the South. Because for me, those were my friends. Those were the people I went to school with every day. They were a part of my innate circle, except for when I came home. I didn't have white people in my house, but I had them everywhere else I went. So that was normal for me. And then I went to an HBCU campus as an adult, a young adult, to get an education, and I felt marginalized because I didn't identify, which was part of why I chose to do that, because I could have gone to a majority school where I would have been a minority, but I said, no, I need to go beyond what's comfortable and do something different to make sure that I know within myself who I identify to be. And now I'm married to a white male. Ding! Turn all racism upside down. I'm black, I'm a preacher who identifies bisexual, and I married a white man from the South. But it's because I've embraced the fact that all those differences are really just on the outside. He's the same individual under his skin as I am. We're human beings. He just happens to be a little lighter toned than I am. Doesn't make him any less than, because he is. Doesn't make him any greater, because he is. I embraced him because I loved him, not because of who he is in color. And we all have to be willing to have people in our circle that are not necessarily like what we're accustomed to, because I think it shapes us into better individuals, because then culturally we're much more diverse and we're much more inclusive of others, because we've embraced other things that are different than what we've always called normal for ourselves.
Absolutely, and I'm glad, Michael, that you brought up Colin, because there are some people who are critical of his point of view and his ideology. But this also is going to come back to you full circle, because there are other public figures, sport figures, who do really great advocating work. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's Wade Davis. And specifically, I want to read to you a quote from Michael Sam. So Michael Sam, for those who don't know, was drafted into the NFL. He's a black male. He kissed his white boyfriend live on television on ESPN for the world to see. He did an interview in Attitude magazine, and he spoke about the discrimination from white people in the LGBT community versus homophobia from black people in the heterosexual community. So the quote says this. It says, "It's terrible. You want to be accepted by other people, but you don't even accept someone just because of the color of their skin. I just don't understand that at all. How are you saying that? Oh, I want people to accept me because I'm gay, but I don't accept you because you're black, or because you're white, or because you're Asian." So he was pointing out, and you can speak a little bit about that because you have some selective insight. He was pointing out that a movement that focuses on equality practices inequality. So shed some light on that, and if you do have any stories about, your racism when you are together, because obviously when you're separated, you're living a white life and a black life, and then when you come together, there's an interracial makeup that a lot of people don't get to experience.
Right.
So shed some light on that.
Well, it's an interesting set of circumstances because oftentimes we go out on our dates and we're in public in spaces that we may or may not have gone to before, and people don't know us, and there's this inherent nature after we're done eating and the check comes that they give him the ticket. Just innately. And it's laughable for us at this point because the check will sit there and they'll come back and say, "Well, are you ready for the check?" And he'll say, "No, because you made an assumption that I'm paying. That's my husband. He's taking care of the check." And it's a teachable moment for whoever may be waiting our table. But it's inherent, especially when we're in the South. Now, we've traveled outside of the South, and people are like, "Who would you like to pay?" But when we're in the southern states, that's almost always our circumstance. But even in our families, one of the things that we decided in our wedding to do was start with the conversation at the very beginning of our ceremony around race. Our overarching theme was the song "Glory." And that we wanted to tear down stigma from the very first words people heard in our ceremony, to say that while we're two separate races of people being joined as one, we're still human beings. All we want to be acknowledged as is human beings. And so that's how we set our standard for the day and had a beautiful ceremony. And so as we go forward, he's not my white husband, he's my husband. He's Kevin. That's how I articulate to people. He just so happens to be white, and some people are shocked by that, but I don't see him that way. And conversely, he doesn't see me as his black husband or his stallion, as it may be said in some circles. I'm just his husband, Warren. So I think we just, again, have to, even though our families didn't have that integration prior to us integrating, it doesn't make it right or wrong. But it's not wrong that we chose to do that, because that's who we are. That's where we are in our space. And like you said earlier, it's generational. My mother or father probably never would, but that doesn't make it right for me. And if I choose to have children, if my children choose to do different than I and my husband have chosen, they should have the right to be able to do that as well.
Absolutely. And Shantae, you can speak to that as well, because your last name is hyphenated, and you are married. So, but you also spoke about nonconformity, which is a very interesting topic in the LGBTQ community, because we have heterosexual stereotypical gender roles, especially in our relationships. So shed some light on that and some challenges you face with that.
I think it took me a long time to realize that I myself was engaging in toxic hetero norms for relationships, because growing up, since I didn't have a couple to look to as an LGBT couple, I looked at straight couples in straight movies, and I looked at what the man was supposed to do and who was supposed to provide what. And for a while, I tried to implement that into my own relationships, not knowing that was like creating this atmosphere of toxic engagement. And like when we would go out, people would assume that I was getting the check. For reasons of, obviously, I'm the most masculine one, so I must have everything figured out at this table, which may not always be the case. So, like you said, it's a teachable moment when I go out with my wife and they hand me the check, and then I just sit there and I'm like, well, I'm not the one paying, but you assumed that I was, right? And then they're like, you actually, you know what, you were right. You were so right. I'm apologize. But, I mean, that's just the surface of a little bit of what goes on. In my own advocacy, I run into the to the issue of sometimes before I present, people think that I'm a volunteer, or people think that I am the waiter at a gala when I go. We need to start talking about the racism that happens within our LGBT community, because it's so prevalent, and we need to start talking about the erasure of black contributions to the LGBT movement nationally, because we shouldn't have to die in order for people like Marsha P. Johnson to be acknowledged as someone who was actually one of the catalysts in the Stonewall movement. And for myself, I deal with that as well when I go into planning groups, and the last thing on the agenda is maybe a session about POC folks, but it's only 10 minutes of the 3-hour segment. We need to give the visibility and the acknowledgement and everything that POC people and black folks in general deserve in the LGBT community, because it's one thing to already hear this stuff from your own folks. So you go into these GSA meetings and then you're wondering why you feel out of place. It's just an added stressor, and that's why oftentimes a lot of black folks decide not to engage into these spaces, because they feel like it's not for them.
Absolutely, and I'm glad, because you have a perspective from an organization with your ties with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and there are so many other organizations, especially in our local area, Birmingham, Alabama, that employ and utilize racial justice programs. And one that I'm very fond of, and I want to share another statistic, just kidding. It's just an article of a close friend of mine who works for the YWCA Central Alabama, Rebecca Harkless. She's a social justice programs coordinator there. And she wrote an article on AL.com, and it just spoke volumes. So Rebecca and I, we're, I think, 2 years apart, and we went to a predominantly white high school. So for her, being older than me and being in the same realm of empowerment, advocating, she is like my role model. So when she wrote this article, and it's entitled, quote unquote, "My race can't be changed, so let's talk about it," period. Okay? Read the article. It was great. I felt so good. I went to work. I called her. I was like, girl, that was so good. I'm so glad. Went down to the comments section. She had over 800 comments. Okay? Most of them obviously were negative. But just highlighting, and as you said, getting people to start having those conversations is the most important part. I just, like I said, it was just astounding, some of the things that I read in the comment section. And that goes back to social media as a platform. There are a lot of people who kind of blindly sit there and just rip people apart, not even realizing some of the mental degradation and all of that. I mean, it's just horrifying. I can't even express how awful it is. And it looks like we have an email question. All right, so this question is from Michael. And Michael says, many of our patient population that live in rural counties are not aware of services provided by 1917. Those patients that are aware often voice difficulties with transportation to the clinic from outlying areas. Are there any ideas on how to help / not discriminate for these patients? And I guess that's going to be centered towards you, Michael.
That's a big issue, obviously, is people not being able to come to their clinic appointments. I know, and it's kind of a growing, I think it's just in its initial phases, but telemedicine is becoming a big tool that helps providers and caregivers reach who they need to reach. I know that a lot of our social workers and nurses and doctors, I mean, sometimes their hands are tied with being able to help provide and facilitate transportation. And it's tough. If you can't go to your doctor's appointments, it's hard to live a normal, healthy life. And we're continuing to try and address that.
Absolutely. Telemedicine is about to be a huge thing. I went to a conference on it earlier this year, and it was just fascinating, some of the technology that is employed. And Warren, I want to go back to you because I spoke briefly about my role model, and it wasn't necessarily in the LGBT community. It was more so of an advocate standpoint. But I want to know, because there are some people who believe that the LGBTQ movement is led by primarily white people, primarily male. So I want to know if there are any, I mean, we have so many. I mean, you turn on TV, there's Ellen. You turn on TV, there's Anderson Cooper. Turn on TV, there's Don Lemon. There are so many people, but there seems to be some lack of leadership when it comes to progressing the movement forward. So I want to know from you personally if you have any role models or people that you look up to or hope that they can kind of take the torch and lead this fight for equality.
I do, but they aren't necessarily under the LGBTQ umbrella. My shero that I spoke of earlier, Dr. Janetta Besh-Cole, will forever be probably the person I look to when it comes to being more thoughtful and inclusive in my everyday walk, because she lives authentically just that. She's the first feminist that I encountered on a personal level that gave me a different perspective when it came to women than even my mother and my grandmother and the women that I grew up around had given me in terms of how I approach my day-to-day interaction with even my women folk. And I'm going to steal that from her. But it was she who helped me understand that the difference in all of us is the uniqueness about all of us. And because we're all unique, we will be different. And when that rang in my mind, and I continued to hear that voice say that to me, I think is when my light bulb went off. And it said, Warren, yes, in many ways you are different. That makes you unique and special. So go and be unique. Go and be special. And so in my work as a peer linkage specialist, it's always my daily goal to be unique and special while I offer the information that is for the greater good of the communities that I serve, either in Alabama or abroad. Because I try to empower people with 3 words that inherently we don't often say to ourselves in the mirror. And those 3 words are, I am somebody. And so every day, my center is getting in front of the mirror before I see anybody else and say to the person looking back at me, I am somebody. Because I have to love me first. And then when I love me, I can go love on everybody else that I encounter that day. Because I don't know what the day's going to bring. I can't dictate what my audience looks like. I may know the location, but I don't know who the people are going to be that are going to show up. But because I'm authentically loving of myself, I can be ready to love on everybody else when I get there.
Absolutely. And I want to hear from both of you. We have about 3 minutes left in this live broadcast, but just some role models or some people that you look up to in this battle for equality.
I think my shero is actually my mentor, Chinyere Ezie, who is now a trial lawyer in New York. She taught me that I didn't have to limit myself to the idea of what scholarship is, because I personally I wasn't able to finish school because I was kicked out of my home for being gay. So when I would go into advocacy spaces with people who have degrees, I would have this internal battle of maybe I'm not smart enough, maybe because I don't know what they're talking about right now, I can't possibly be qualified to sit at the table with these folks. And it was watching her navigate in spaces where she's the minority as a black woman with locks, really taught me how to stand in my truth. And aside from that, actually, I get a lot of my motivation from music. I'm quite the music junkie, and when I decided that I was going to be out and comfortable in my masculinity, I actually listened to, and those for you who are watching who know this person, shout out to y'all. His name is Chance the Rapper. He released this mixtape called Acid Rap, and it's full of just thinking about what you need to do and just getting up and doing it and being comfortable in your truth. And I listened to that album for a year straight. That is where I get my motivation from. And actually, lastly, it's the youth that I work with. because the youth that I work with remind me that I still have work to do. And the things that they do currently, like how brave they are in the 9th grade telling teachers, well, you need to be comfortable with the fact that I'm taking my girlfriend to prom, okay? I didn't do that when I was in high school. But when I look at them, I think of promise, and I think of what I can do next to make sure that they can keep doing what they're doing in the schools and everywhere else.
Absolutely. Very briefly, Michael, we have 1 minute left.
I don't particularly have like one major big time role model, but I think I always look at the allies of the LGBTQ community, and I admire. I mean, it takes courage for them as well to be an ally, just as much as it takes courage to be a member of the LGBTQ community, and I don't think we would necessarily be where we're at or going to where we're going without their help.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that is the essence of all of this, is that we need to depend on everyone else as well as depend on ourselves. So I want to thank everybody here on our panel today. It's been a great topic. I also want to thank everyone watching. I want to give much thanks to all of our campaign providers and funders. Be sure to follow us on all of our social media outlets at Start Talking Alabama. Thank you.